Welcome to Nowhere to Hide. I'm Brian Hyde. Today we're going to be talking about why Idaho deserves grocery tax relief as well as school choice. You wouldn't think these would be controversial topics, but guess what? Anytime politics is involved, they are controversial. I've got some reasons why they are ideas whose time has come, and we'll get to them in just a few moments.
Press club or bias all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.
Once again, I welcome you to Nowhere to Hide. Twice a week, I have the opportunity to sit down and to go over a couple of these interesting topics in some detail. And it's not to say that the legacy press always gets it wrong. They don't, but sometimes they omit some nuance and they omit some of the finer points that need to be considered. In other words, there's a very clear bias that seems to come down always on the side of the state. Well, what about the government? Isn't the government there to solve all of our problems? Well, if you're a person who's serious about freedom, you know there is a proper role for government, and its job is to protect God-given rights. But you can get too much of a good thing. That includes government. So let's dive into the topic of grocery tax reform. In fact, we'll call it grocery tax relief. First of all, we're going to turn to Senator Glenita Zuiderveld, who had an excellent piece on her Substack saying, look, to everything there is a season. She actually quoted the song from the Byrds from back in 1965, and it's true. To everything there's a season, turn. Well, Glenita says it is time. This is the season for the grocery tax repeal. And she gives some pretty good ideas, as well as some of the objections why it shouldn't be done. She says you hear all the excuses for why the grocery tax shouldn't be repealed. Some say it's not a significant amount of relief, but we must always seek ways to alleviate burdens on our constituents. Man, I love elected people, and especially legislators, who think in this way. And that relief, she says, needs to come, or the alleviation of these burdens need to happen regardless of the size. And because this is a small amount, she points out, our state government won't suffer when the grocery tax is gone. Now, Glenita says some argue that the grocery tax ensures that illegal immigrants pay their share of taxes. But she says, should we force our citizens to pay extra taxes just to ensure that illegals contribute? In fact, she says, if we want illegal immigrants to pay their fair share, let's focus on securing our borders and helping them come here legally, assimilate as Americans, and become citizens so they can contribute equally to the burdens that we all share to maintain our republic. And by the way, Glenita, I have to give you a quick salute here for saying republic instead of democracy. It's refreshing to know that there are still politicians and people in political office out there who understand that distinction. Now, she says another argument is that we need tourists to help pay their share while visiting our state. But again, we're punishing Idaho citizens just to collect a few crumbs from travelers. In reality, more tourist dollars would flow into Idaho businesses, helping our local economy thrive. And when our businesses thrive, so does our state. Now, there's something to consider here, too. And I don't want to be negative, in bringing this up. But if you remember back in 2008, 2009, particularly as gas prices were inching up to $4 and $5 a gallon in most parts of the country, what happened to tourism-based economies? They suffered because people said, you know what? We just can't afford to travel. And so, again, putting it on the tourists, well, the tourists will be the ones who pay most of this. That's not a good thing to be counting on. And I agree with Glenita. When our businesses thrive, so does our state. Now, she also points out here, it's time to give Idahoans the relief they deserve, to make them our top priority. It's time to expose waste, misappropriation, lost funds, and it's time to say no to adding another agency, program, or government worker. You don't find the courage to say no very often within, the government ranks. But here you have a state senator who is willing to say, no, it's time to break free from dependency on federal dollars that cause us to lose local control. She says it's time to put Idaho first. And by the way, one of the objections that people sometimes raise is, well, what about the grocery tax credit? And Glenita says, well, it's not an either or choice. You can keep that if you want. But the idea of reducing everybody's tax burden just sounds a whole lot more in keeping with good government, or at least a free state, than does, well, we need to apportion the misery more equitably and make sure that everybody is suffering equally. which is where a lot of the statists kind of come from in terms of how they approach this. Now, let's shift to the topic of school choice. This is another idea whose time has come. There's a very strong likelihood that we will see some very meaningful school choice legislation come forward in the next legislative session come January. That's a good thing. Ron Nate from the Idaho Freedom Foundation has a great comparison here. And I want you to see the graphic here, first of all. School choice 2025, Nero, Ford, and Friedman. Now, you may be wondering, why is he referencing three very different historical figures? You remember, of course, Emperor Nero. The legend has it he sat there and fiddled as Rome burned, a show of his indifference toward the suffering of the people. Henry Ford, famous for quoting, you can have a Ford in any color you want as long as it's black. And Thomas Friedman, who actually had some very good ideas, or Milton Friedman, excuse me. Sorry, Thomas. Sorry, Milton. Milton Friedman, who actually had a very key observation about what happens when we allow competition to take place and when we allow specifically dollars for education to follow the student rather than just prop up a system. Let's take a look at this. Ronald Nate from the Idaho Freedom Foundation says the problem: Idaho's public school system lacks the incentives for efficiency and excellence. Grown-ups know it, parents are frustrated, and children suffer. So the solution would be competition via school choice, which would actually reduce costs, improve opportunities, and reverse the spiral, but it never gets done. Nero says, problem? What problem? And by the way, Nero is represented by a lot of folks in state government at this point. We don't see a problem. Why? So Ron asks the question, is our legislature playing Nero's fiddle with regard to public education, showing that extreme indifference to a problem that really exists? And here's the problem outlined. IFF reported the following last January. It's time for a reality check on performance. Take a look at two telling statistics in Idaho. First, reading and math proficiency for Idaho 8th graders on the National Assessment of Educational Progress, or NAEP, were just 32 and 28% in 2003. 19 years later, these same tests revealed just 32% and 32% proficiency. That's near zero progress. The raw numbers are startling, says Ron, and this dismal outcome reveals 15,983 third graders who cannot read at grade level, leaving just 7,521 who can. So it's not like, well, this is just a solution looking for a problem. There's a very real problem. And unfortunately, for people who think and speak in slogans, especially bumper sticker slogans, the idea is, when are we going to fully fund Idaho students? You've been throwing a lot of money at them. There has been hundreds of millions of dollars allocated. Some of these school districts actually have budget surpluses in the millions and millions of dollars, and yet it doesn't really seem to change the end result. So maybe it's time to look at doing something different. So secondly, Ron says, let's consider the record on spending. Could it be that schools need more resources? Since 2003, K through 12 education spending in Idaho has increased from $986 million to over $3.2 billion in 2022. We have tripled state spending on schools and education, yet we have continued to see student performance go nowhere. Even worse, while performance wanes and suffering continues, schools sometimes even do worse. They divert resources and implement curricula or activities that are harmful to kids, offensive to parents, and violative of the mission of public education. Now, a lot of the really woke, really ugly, provocative sex education stuff, trying to persuade kids, hey, it's time that you start questioning your body when you're not playing with it. And that kind of stuff really has no place in our public schools. And by the way, people who maintain, well, but somebody's got to talk to these kids about sex. If that is your mantra, go turn yourself into the local police department, have them search your computer for whatever they need to find to convict you and lock you up. That's not a healthy attitude. You do not need to be talking to other people's children about sex. I don't care how, much concern you couch it in. All right, moving on. Next, we have Henry Ford. No choice is a choice. Ron asks, is the problem that public education is full of bad people trying to do bad things? And his answer is, I don't think so. The problem is the lack of incentives to make public education be efficient, responsive, and excellent. The funding is done by appropriation by a third party, that being the legislature, not directly affected by their decisions. So the work is done by government employees who are not rewarded for excellence or efficiency. In fact, the worse the system does, the more the outcry for bigger budgets. But as Ron points out, folks, it's not a money problem. Parents who are frustrated with their public schools aren't met with much sympathy. Policymakers and administrators give responses similar to Henry Ford when he famously said, any customer can have a car painted any color that he wants as long as it's black. Similarly, the Idaho education establishment and many in Idaho government say the same thing about education choice. You can choose any school for your free, that is taxpayer-funded education, as long as it's a public school. As long as there's choice within the public school system, well, then they say you actually have a choice. But what if you want a choice outside of that system? Wow, that's crazy talk. He says parents who press the issue further might be told if you don't like it, then file a complaint, take your kid to private school and pay double, or homeschool them at your own expense. No assistance is offered, which brings us to school choice. Ron says, surprisingly, despite the many failed attempts for real school choice in Idaho, Governor Brad Little has touted Idaho as already a leader in school choice. He claims that charter schools and other public schools are all the choice parents need. Now, in 2023, when signing a bill to let parents send their kids to any public school, he said, Idaho parents already benefit from an abundance of school choice options. And this new law expands their ability to choose the best public school for their child, regardless of their zip code. Do you see the problem here? It's the whole Henry Ford thing. They can choose any kind of school they want as long as it's within the public school system. And again, what if parents want a choice that is outside of that system? I know statism is the belief that anything that's not under the control of the state is somehow by definition out of control. But in this case, parents deserve a choice. More importantly, the students deserve a choice because not everybody learns exactly the same way. Now, Milton, that is, A Better Path. Milton said, given at present that parents can send their children to government schools without special payment, very few can or will send them to other schools unless they too are subsidized. Let the subsidy be made available to parents regardless where they send their children. In other words, let the money follow the child. Fund the child's education, not the system. And this simple solution will achieve amazing results. Now, Ronald Nate says, look, as I said at the beginning, it's a serious problem with a simple solution. But he says the will to act has been lacking. Certainly special interests, and this would include teachers' unions, school boards, the education establishment, they don't want school choice. They enjoy that monopoly. But after decades of lavish budgets, flat results, and frustrated parents and children, it's time we followed the best practices of school choice. Efficiency and excellence will follow, and children will thrive. And he actually gives a great example here of how that can be illustrated. You want a great burger tonight? Competition promises you many burger options, various prices, all without the government telling burger companies what to do. So education could use this as a model. You want great education for your kid? Let competition guide schools and curriculum providers to the education options parents want most for their kids. It's not rocket science, unless, of course, parents want rocket science for their kids. And Ron says, I've seen science-focused private schools. The problem here is that there are people who do not trust you to make those choices. Maybe it's time that they took a back seat and stopped interfering with those choices. I'm Brian Hyde, and this is Nowhere to Hide.
Idaho Press Club or bias all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
Dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.